There are cities built on ambition, on dreams, on the sweat of ordinary men who believed that if they worked hard enough, long enough, the world would eventually be fair. And then, there are cities built on something darker. New York City, 1930s, a place where police badges had prices, where judges had favorites, where the most powerful men in the country didn't sit in the White House. They sat in back rooms of Italian restaurants, eating steak and deciding who lived and who disappeared. No trial, no appeal, no record, just a decision. And then, silence. This is the story of the Genovese Crime Family, one of the 5 most feared mafia dynasties in American history. At their peak, they didn't just run the streets, they ran the city, and parts of the country most people never even knew were for sale. They came from Sicily with nothing, no money, no English, no connections, but they carried something else, a code. A way of life, forged across centuries in the mountains of southern Italy, where governments rose and fell, but one thing never changed. The state could not protect you. Only your family could. Only your loyalty could. It was called La Cosa Nostra, our thing. Not a gang, not a club, a philosophy, a parallel world with its own courts, its own economy, and its own brutal sense of justice. When Sicilian immigrants brought this world to America in the late 1800s, it took root quietly, in neighborhoods, in markets, in the gaps between what the law covered and what it ignored. Then came Prohibition, 1920. The United States government made alcohol illegal, and in doing so, handed organized crime the single greatest business opportunity in history. Overnight, bootleggers became millionaires. Criminal networks that had operated on the margins now controlled entire cities. And from this chaos, one man began to see further than everyone else. A cold, calculating man from Naples who had arrived in New York as a teenager, with nothing but ambition and an absolute absence of hesitation. His name was Charles Luciano, later known as Lucky, though luck had very little to do with it. In 1931, Luciano did something that no gangster had dared before. He organized the American Mafia. He called a meeting, and then, in one brutal week known as the Castellamarese War's final act, he had the old guard eliminated. The bosses who refused to modernize, the men who still thought in old-world terms, gone. What replaced them was a commission. 5 families, 1 city, shared territory, shared rules. Anyone who broke those rules didn't receive a warning, they received a funeral. And within that new order, one name was rising faster than all the others. A man so dangerous, so unpredictable, so utterly without mercy, that even his closest allies slept with one eye open. His name was Vito Genovese. By the 1950s, the Genovese family wasn't just a criminal organization, it was a machine. And like any machine, it had structure, discipline, and an appetite that never stopped. They controlled the longshoremen's unions on the docks, meaning every ship that entered New York Harbor paid a tax. They owned gambling operations across 5 boroughs, loan sharks who charged interest rates that would make a banker faint, nightclubs where the beautiful people danced, not knowing who owned the floor beneath their feet, construction contracts, sanitation routes, even legitimate businesses, restaurants, laundromats, trucking companies, were touched by their invisible hand. If it moved through New York, the Genovese family took a cut. Vito Genovese himself ruled through something more refined than violence. Anyone can use violence. It's crude, it's loud, it attracts attention. Genovese ruled through uncertainty. That was his true weapon. You never knew when you'd crossed him. You never knew who was reporting to him. You never knew if the man smiling across the table from you had already made a phone call that sealed your fate. One story, never confirmed, never denied, says that Genovese once had a man killed simply for making eye contact with his wife at a dinner party. The body was found the next morning in a car outside Brooklyn. No witnesses, no evidence, just a message. The message was never stated. It didn't need to be. Everyone understood. But power built on fear is always fragile, because fear requires constant maintenance, and maintaining it requires decisions, and every decision leaves a trail. In 1957, a moment of extraordinary arrogance nearly brought everything down. The bosses of organized crime, from New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, New Orleans, and dozens of cities in between, decided to hold a summit, a meeting to discuss business, territories, and the growing pressure from federal investigators. They chose a farmhouse in Appalachian, New York, a quiet, rural location, remote, invisible. What they didn't account for was a local state trooper named Edgar Croswell, who noticed that an unusual number of expensive cars, Cadillacs, Lincolns, Chryslers, were arriving at a private property on a quiet country road. He called for backup, set up a roadblock, and waited. When the raid came, over 100 of the most powerful organized crime figures in America were caught running through the woods in hand-stitched Italian suits. Some were found hiding in the bushes, others tried to drive through the roadblock. One man, reportedly worth millions, was found crouching behind a tree in a forest, covered in mud, with $300,000 in cash in his coat pocket. It was almost absurd, but the consequences were anything but. The Appalachian meeting exposed the Mafia to the American public in a way that could no longer be denied or dismissed. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, a man who had publicly and repeatedly insisted that organized crime on a national scale simply did not exist, could no longer look away. He had been wrong, or he had been lying. Either way, the era of official ignorance was over. The machine had been seen, and once you're seen, the clock starts ticking. The Mafia had survived for generations on one principle above all others, one word that every member swore by, from the lowest associate to the highest boss. Omerta, the code of silence. You do not speak to police. You do not speak to prosecutors. You do not speak to journalists. You take your secrets to the grave, and you do so willingly, because you understand that the grave is the only alternative to silence. It had held for decades, through arrests, through trials, through every attempt by law enforcement to crack the organization from within. No one talked. Not really. Not about structure, not about names, not about the rules. Until Joseph Valachi. Valachi was not a boss. He was not powerful. He was a low-level soldier in the Genovese family, a man who had spent his entire adult life inside the organization, carrying out orders, keeping his head down, surviving. Then, in 1962, while serving a prison sentence, he became convinced, rightly or wrongly, that Vito Genovese had ordered him killed, that a fellow prisoner was sent to murder him. In a moment of panic, Valachi killed the man first, the wrong man as it turned out, but the damage was done. He was now facing a murder charge on top of his existing sentence. He had nothing left to lose, so he made a decision that shook the foundations of organized crime in America. In 1963, Joseph Valachi sat before a United States Senate subcommittee on live, nationally televised hearings and talked. He named names. He described initiation rituals. He explained the hierarchy, the boss, the underboss, the consigliere, the capos, the soldiers. He mapped territories. He described murders. He gave investigators a window into a world they had been trying to see clearly for 30 years. He told investigators simply, "I know I'm dead. I just want to take some of them with me." Across the country, mob bosses watched the hearings on television in disbelief. The code had broken, the wall had cracked, and everyone knew, once it cracks, it never fully holds again. Vito Genovese himself was already behind bars by the time Valachi testified. Convicted in 1959 on drug trafficking charges, in a trial that many historians believe was deliberately engineered by his own allies, men who feared him so much that they preferred to see him imprisoned than free. He died in a federal prison in 1969, powerful to the last breath, but alone. The family survived him. It adapted, as criminal organizations always do, but the world around it was changing in ways that no amount of adaptation could fully address. In 1970, the United States Congress passed the RICO Act, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Statute. It was a legal revolution. Before RICO, prosecutors had to prove individual crimes, one by one. A murder here, a bribe there. Slow, difficult, often impossible. RICO changed the rules entirely. Now, prosecutors could target the organization itself. Being a member of a criminal enterprise, participating in its culture, its rituals, its business, was itself a crime. You didn't have to pull the trigger, you just had to be inside the room. The FBI began planting bugs, surveilling social clubs, recording conversations in restaurants, building cases not against individual criminals, but against entire families at once. And then came the last great act of Genovese defiance. Vincent Gigante became boss in the 1980s, a huge, heavy-set man who had once been a professional boxer. To avoid prosecution, he deployed a strategy so brazen it almost deserves admiration. Every morning, he put on a bathrobe and slippers. He wandered the streets of Greenwich Village, muttering to himself, looking confused, stumbling, talking to no one. When police tried to question him, he seemed not to understand the questions. His lawyers argued for years that their client was mentally incompetent, too ill to stand trial. The FBI called him the Odd Father. For over a decade, it actually worked. Federal judges looked at the shuffling man in the bathrobe and granted delays. Mental health evaluations produced conflicting results. The trial kept getting postponed. Meanwhile, on recorded tapes and in testimony from informants, Vincent Gigante was heard running the family with complete clarity, making decisions, ordering hits, managing territory. The bathrobe was a costume. The madness was a performance. Eventually, even that wasn't enough. In 1997, Gigante was convicted, and in 2003, just before his death, he finally admitted what everyone had known for 20 years, that the whole act had been a lie. The Genovese crime family still exists today, Diminished, fragmented, watched on all sides, but not gone. Like a fire that has been reduced to embers, it no longer burns down buildings, but it still burns. What they built, across nearly a century of blood, silence, and calculated brutality, was something that no government program, no law, no documentary can fully explain. It was an entire world existing inside our world, with its own courts, its own economy, its own morality, its own version of justice, swift, certain, and final. And the most unsettling truth of all? Most of it happened in plain sight, in restaurants you've driven past, in neighborhoods you've walked through, in handshakes between men whose names appear in no newspaper, whose faces appear in no photograph, whose existence the official world preferred not to acknowledge. We like to believe that power follows rules, that authority comes from institutions, that the systems we've built, the laws, the courts, the elections, are the real foundation of how the world works. The Genovese family spent a century quietly proving otherwise. They understood something that most people spend their entire lives refusing to accept. The most dangerous power is not the power that announces itself. It's not the power that wears a uniform or holds a title. It's the power that stays invisible, that operates in the margins, that moves through the cracks in every system ever built by men who believed the system was enough. The empire is diminished, but the lesson remains. Sleep well.